There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They wear the camouflage of a Tuesday night, or the quiet hum of a refrigerator, or the familiar weight of a body shifting on a shared couch. You don't recognize them as watershed events at the time. There is no thunderclap, no orchestral score swelling in the background. There is only the moment itself, small and plain and happening to you. It's only later, when you trace the map of your life backward, that you see it for what it was, the precise coordinate where the landscape of your heart tilted on its axis, and everything, absolutely everything, began to change. For me, that moment smelled like old books and the faint, clean scent of Alex's shampoo. It felt like the heavy, trusting weight of his head in my lap. And it sounded like the gentle, rhythmic whisper of his breath as he slept, completely unaware that he was dismantling my world, one quiet exhalation at a time. It hadn't always been like this. In fact, for the first 5 years of our friendship, it had been precisely not like this. The architecture of our relationship was built on a foundation of sturdy, well-defined boundaries, walls I had meticulously constructed and reinforced out of a desperate need for self-preservation. Alex was the sun, and I was a planet caught in his orbit, content to circle him at a safe and predictable distance, warmed by his light, but never daring to get close enough to burn. We met in our second year of university, at a party thrown by a mutual acquaintance in a cramped, humid apartment that throbbed with the bass of a song I didn't recognize. I was a photography student, more comfortable observing from the periphery, my camera a shield that allowed me to participate without truly engaging. I was documenting the night, framing slices of contrived joy, when he had burst into my field of view. Alex was magnetic, a gravitational force pulling laughter and conversation and light towards him. He was a software engineering major, but he moved with the unthinking grace of an athlete, all easy confidence and broad, genuine smiles. He was telling a story, his hands carving animated shapes in the air, his friends hanging on every word. I remember thinking, with a detached, artistic appreciation, that he was beautifully composed. The way the low, colored light caught the line of his jaw, the crinkles that formed at the corners of his eyes when he laughed. I took a picture, a single, stolen frame. It was a perfect shot, technically speaking. The focus was sharp, the composition was balanced, the moment was captured. It was also the first piece of evidence in a case I would spend years building against myself. He noticed me a few minutes later. His conversation lulled, and his eyes swept the room, finally landing on the quiet figure in the corner. He didn't glower or look suspicious, the way some people did when they saw a camera pointed in their general direction. Instead, a slow, curious smile spread across his face. He excused himself from his circle and navigated the crowded room, a ship charting a course directly for my small, isolated island. I felt a surge of panic, a fight-or-flight instinct that told me to blend into the wallpaper. But there was nowhere to go. "You're the ghost," he said, his voice warm and a little amused. It was louder than I expected, cutting through the party's din with ease. I must have looked confused, because he elaborated. "The photography ghost. I've seen you at a few of these things. Always in the corner, capturing souls," he grinned, and it was like a light turning on. "So, did you get mine?" My own voice, when I finally found it, was a quiet murmur in comparison. "I might have. Can I see?" I hesitated. My photos felt intensely personal, a secret catalog of the way I saw the world. Showing them to a subject, especially one as radiant as him, felt like turning a page in my diary and holding it up for inspection. But there was a genuine curiosity in his eyes, an openness that was disarming. I turned the small screen on the back of my camera toward him. He leaned in, his shoulder brushing against mine, and the world seemed to narrow to that single point of contact. The air filled with his scent, something clean and faintly spicy, like cedar and soap. He was silent for a long moment, studying the image of himself laughing. "Wow," he said, his voice softer now. "You made me look happy." "You were," I replied, my throat suddenly dry. "Yeah, but you saw it." He looked from the screen to me, his gaze direct and searching. "You see things, don't you? The rest of us are just crashing around, and you're actually watching." That was the beginning. Our friendship bloomed in the unlikely soil between his vibrant, sunlit world and my quiet, shadowed one. He would seek me out, pulling me from the edges into the warmth of his circle. He learned my name, Leo, and seemed to enjoy saying it. He was fascinated by my photography, by the slow, deliberate process of the darkroom, the magic of an image emerging from nothing in a tray of chemicals. I was fascinated by him, by the effortless way he moved through the world, by the kindness that underpinned his confident exterior, by the way he made me feel seen, not just as a camera-wielding ghost, but as a person. After graduation, we found ourselves in the same city, clinging to the familiar comfort of each other amidst the disorienting newness of adult life. When the lease was up on my tiny studio, he was the one who suggested we get a place together. It was a practical decision, he'd argued. Cheaper rent, a better neighborhood. For me, it was a terrifying, exhilarating proposition. Living with Alex meant living with the constant, low-level hum of my unspoken affection. It was like agreeing to live inside a bell, knowing that at any moment, a single wrong move could cause a deafening, shattering clang. But I said yes. Of course I said yes. Our apartment became my sanctuary and my torture chamber. It was a two-bedroom place with a shared living room that got the best afternoon light. My room was a carefully curated space of quiet order, my photography equipment neatly stored, my prints arranged on the walls in precise grids. His room was a state of chaotic entropy, clothes on the floor, tech gadgets in various states of disassembly on his desk. But the living room was our shared territory, the neutral ground where our two worlds met. It was where we had movie marathons, where we ate takeout on the floor, where he would tell me about his consulting trips and the endless parade of beige hotel rooms, and where I would show him my latest prints, listening intently to his unvarnished, often surprisingly insightful opinions. And it was where I watched him fall in love with Sarah. She was lovely, bright, funny, and a perfect match for his energy. She fit into his life as if she were a missing piece he hadn't known he was looking for. I learned to perform a specific kind of alchemy, transforming the sharp pang of jealousy into a practiced, placid smile. I became their friend, the stable, reliable Leo. I was the one who took their anniversary photos, the one who listened to Alex's anxieties about meeting her parents, the one who helped him pick out a Christmas gift for her. I walled off the part of my heart that ached for him, breaking it up so thoroughly that sometimes even I could almost forget it was there. My love for him became a ghost limb, an ache in a place that had been amputated for the sake of survival. The friendship was too precious to risk. He was too precious to lose. So I learned to live with the quiet hum, the constant awareness of the bell, and I became an expert at moving so carefully that it never, ever rang. This delicate, painful equilibrium held for 3 years. 3 years of shared dinners, inside jokes, and the comfortable silence that can only exist between two people who know each other intimately. 3 years of me watching him live a life that I was a part of, but never the center of. I built my own life in the spaces he didn't occupy. I had my photography, my freelance work, a small circle of my own quiet friends. I convinced myself it was enough. That this orbit, this safe distance, was a form of happiness. I had his friendship, and that had to be enough. It was a mantra I repeated to myself in the dark, a prayer for contentment. Then came the shift, the catalyst that cracked the foundation of the world I had so carefully constructed. It wasn't a sudden earthquake, but a slow, grinding pressure that began with a phone call. Alex was on a consulting trip in Chicago, and he called me late one night, his voice strained and hollow. It was over with Sarah. It hadn't been a dramatic blowout, but a slow, sad erosion. A realization on both their parts that the future they had been building together was on a foundation of sand. He sounded lost, adrift in a sterile hotel room 1,000 miles from home. I don't know what to do, Leo, he'd whispered into the phone, and the sound of his voice, stripped of all its usual confidence, was a physical blow. Everything feels wrong. Come home, I said, the words simple and solid. Just get on the next flight. Come home. When he walked through the door the next day, he looked like a ship that had been battered by a hurricane. His shoulders were slumped, his eyes were shadowed with exhaustion, and the usual light in him was dimmed to a faint flicker. He dropped his bags in the hallway and just stood there, looking at me as if I were the only lighthouse in a world of stormy seas. I didn't say anything. I just opened my arms. He collapsed into me, his body heavy with a grief that was more than just the end of a relationship. It was the death of a future, of a version of himself he thought he knew. He held on to me, his face buried in my shoulder, and for the first time, the well-defined boundaries of our friendship dissolved into nothing. I was no longer the observer. I was the harbor, and all I could do was hold him and let the storm break. That night was the beginning of the ritual. The grief left him hollowed out, exhausted beyond measure. He tried to retreat to his room, to the chaotic solitude he was used to, but the silence in there was too loud. After an hour of him pacing, I found him standing in the living room, looking haunted. "I can't be in there," he said, his voice rough. "It's too quiet. But it's too loud. Does that make any sense?" It made perfect sense. "Let's watch a movie," I suggested, my voice gentle. "Something stupid. Something we've seen 100 times." He agreed with a grateful, weary nod. We settled onto the couch, our familiar positions from countless movie nights before. Me tucked into the corner, him stretched out on the other end. But the space between us felt different now. It was no longer a comfortable buffer. It was a chasm of his pain. We started the movie, a brainless action flick, but neither of us was watching. The flashing lights on the screen were just a distraction from the heavy silence. About 20 minutes in, he shifted, then shifted again. "This couch is lumpy," he mumbled, a flimsy excuse. He pushed himself up, grabbed the throw pillow from the armchair, and then, without a word, he lay back down, his head landing not on the arm of the couch, but in my lap. My entire body went rigid. The bell, the one I had spent years moving around so carefully, began to vibrate with a terrifying, silent hum. His hair was soft against the denim of my jeans. I could feel the warmth of his scalp, the subtle weight of his skull. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, panicked drumbeat. I was certain he could hear it. I was certain it was the loudest sound in the universe. My mind raced, a frantic catalog of possibilities. Was this a mistake? Was he so tired he didn't realize what he was doing? Was this a test? My hands, which had been resting on my stomach, were now frozen in the air, hovering uselessly. Where could I put them? On the couch? On my knees? On him? The thought was so terrifying, so forbidden, that my fingers twitched. He sighed, a deep, shuddering sound that seemed to release a fraction of the tension in his body. He shifted again, burrowing his head more firmly into my thighs, as if seeking a deeper comfort. He was asleep within minutes. And I was left there, pinned by the weight of him, pinned by the weight of 5 years of carefully suppressed love now flooding every part of me. I sat there for hours, long after the movie had ended and the screen had gone black. I watched the way the faint streetlights coming through the window traced the curve of his cheek. I listened to the sound of his breathing, the soft, vulnerable rhythm of a person who felt safe enough to let go completely. It was agony, and it was the most profoundly beautiful thing I had ever experienced. I was his anchor, his harbor, his solid ground. It was a role I had never asked for, but one I realized, in the silent dark of our living room, I would do anything to keep. This became the new normal, the ritual. It began under the guise of movie nights, a plausible excuse for closeness. Alex would come home from work, his face etched with a weariness that went deeper than his job. He was navigating the lonely, disorienting landscape of a life he hadn't planned, and our apartment was his only sanctuary. He stopped trying to hole up in his room. He would simply gravitate to the living room, to the couch, to me. He'd sink onto the cushions with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the entire world, and I would put on a film. We rarely made it to the end credits. Sooner or later, he would perform the same small migration, shifting until his head was resting in my lap. The first few times, my body still treated it as a state of emergency. My muscles would lock, my breathing would become shallow, and my mind would race with the same frantic analysis. Every tiny movement he made sent a jolt through my system. If his hand, resting on his chest, brushed against my leg, it was an event I would dissect for hours. I was a seismologist monitoring a fault line, hyper-aware of the slightest tremor, terrified of the earthquake it might portend. I lived in a state of suspended animation, a breath held for hours at a time. The simple act of needing to shift my own position or go to the bathroom became a monumental crisis, a complex negotiation between my body's needs and my desperate unwillingness to disturb his peace. But slowly, imperceptibly, my body began to learn a new language. The initial rigidity softened into a cautious acceptance. The panic in my pulse subsided into a low, steady thrum of heightened awareness. I learned the exact weight of his head, the specific way his breathing would deepen just before he drifted off. I learned that he sometimes mumbled in his sleep, fragmented words from work or dreams I couldn't decipher. I started to relax into the role, to accept the intimacy for what it was on the surface, an act of profound, desperate comfort for my grieving friend. My hands, once frozen in indecision, found a home. I would rest one on the back of the couch, just above his head, a silent, hovering guardian. Sometimes, when he was deep in sleep and I was feeling brave, I would let my fingers drift down and brush through his hair. The strands were soft, and the gesture felt both impossibly bold and deeply natural, like a secret I was telling only him, even though he couldn't hear it. The ritual was a fragile ecosystem, sustained by a web of unspoken rules and plausible deniability. We never spoke of it. The next morning, he would wake up on the couch, groaning about a stiff neck, and shuffle off to the shower as if he had simply fallen asleep watching television alone. He would thank me for letting him crash, and I would shrug and say, "It's fine, we talked about everything else." His work, my latest photo series, the mundane logistics of our shared life. But the hours he spent asleep in my lap existed in a silent, protected bubble. It was a secret agreement we had made without ever exchanging a word. He needed the comfort, and I needed to give it. To name it, to question it, would be to shatter the delicate glass of the arrangement. He could pretend he was just exhausted. I could pretend I was just being a good friend. The lie was a kindness we offered each other, a shared fiction that allowed this strange, new intimacy to grow in the dark. My photography began to change. I had always been drawn to landscapes, to still life, to the quiet order of inanimate objects. But now my focus shifted. I found myself obsessed with the way light fell on skin, the geography of a sleeping face, the subtle language of the body at rest. My camera stayed in my room, but my mind was constantly framing shots of him. The curve of his spine as he leaned over his laptop at the kitchen table, the way his fingers curled when he was asleep, the vulnerability in the line of his neck. My art was becoming a reflection of my secret life, a catalog of the quiet, intimate moments that defined my existence. I was developing him in the darkroom of my mind, watching his image slowly emerge, terrified and thrilled by what I was beginning to see. The metaphor of the darkroom felt intensely real. Our living room after sunset became my darkroom. The world outside would fall away, and everything would narrow to the red, safe light glow of our shared, silent space. I was the photographer, carefully tending to this fragile, developing print. Each night he rested his head in my lap was another minute in the chemical bath, the image of what we were becoming growing clearer, more defined. But I was always afraid of overexposing it, of letting in too much light too soon and destroying the image forever. So I kept the door shut, I kept the room dark, and I waited. I waited for the image to fix itself, to become permanent, to be something I could finally hold without fear of it fading away. As autumn bled into winter, the ritual began to evolve. The nights grew colder, and the flimsy excuse of falling asleep during a movie began to wear thin. One night, after I had been sitting there for nearly 3 hours, my leg completely numb, he stirred. He didn't wake up, not fully, but he shifted, murmuring something about the cold. He curled in on himself, his hands tucking under his chin. Without thinking, driven by an impulse that was purely protective, I reached for the thick woolen blanket folded over the back of the armchair and draped it over him. It was another line crossed, another layer of intimacy added. He sighed in his sleep and relaxed under the warmth, settling even more deeply against me. From then on, the blanket became part of the ritual. The moment he laid his head down, I would cover him. It was a gesture of care, of domesticity, that felt dangerously close to the line I was so desperately trying not to cross. But he never questioned it. He accepted it, just as he accepted the comfort of my lap. He was a man adrift at sea, and he had found a life raft. He wasn't about to question why it was warm or why it felt so safe. He just held on. The true escalation, the one that sent the silent hum of the bell into a high, keening vibration, happened on a Tuesday in December. A freezing rain was ticking against the window panes, and the wind was howling a mournful song around the corners of our building. Alex had come home looking utterly defeated. A major project at work had gone sideways, and he had spent the day in tense, fruitless meetings. He skipped dinner, sinking onto the couch with a groan that seemed to come from his very soul. He didn't even pretend to want to watch a movie. He just looked at me, his eyes hollow. "I'm so tired, Leo," he said, the words barely a whisper. "I'm just so tired." He performed the familiar ritual, laying his head in my lap, and I covered him with the blanket. But tonight, the sleep didn't come. He was too tense, his mind too full of the day's failures. He kept shifting, his muscles tight with stress. I could feel the anxiety radiating off him like heat. The silence in the room was thick with it. My hand, resting on the couch behind him, felt impossibly distant. I watched him, my heart aching with a helpless empathy. And then, I did something I had only ever dared to do when he was sound asleep. I moved my hand from the couch to his shoulder, my touch tentative, a question. He flinched, a tiny, almost imperceptible reaction, and my heart plummeted. I had gone too far. I had misread everything. I started to pull my hand away, a hot flush of shame creeping up my neck. But then, he leaned into my touch. It was a small movement, a barely conscious inclination of his body toward the pressure of my palm, but it was a definitive answer. He didn't pull away. He moved closer. So I kept my hand there, my fingers resting on the firm muscle of his shoulder. Slowly, cautiously, I began to rub his back, my hand moving in slow, circular motions. I felt the tension in his shoulders begin to melt under my touch. The tight coil of his body started to unwind. He let out a long, shuddering breath, a sound of pure, unadulterated release. "That feels," he mumbled into my leg, his voice thick with a sleep he was finally succumbing to. "Good. Don't stop." So I didn't. I sat there in the dark, the only sounds the ticking rain and our synchronized breathing, and I rubbed his back until the rhythm of my hand became as natural as the beating of my own heart. This was new territory. This wasn't the plausible deniability of a sleepy friend seeking a pillow. This was active, conscious comfort. He had asked for it. He had leaned into it. The image in my darkroom was becoming sharper, the outlines hardening into something I could no longer deny. But the fear was sharper, too. Because the clearer the image became, the more I had to lose if I exposed it to the light and found that it was just a phantom, a figment of my own desperate imagination. The architecture of our apartment, once a simple floor plan, had become a complex emotional map. The living room was the heart, the space of our ambiguous ritual. Our separate bedrooms were our individual territories, the places we retreated to, the physical manifestations of the lives we led apart from each other. My door was almost always ajar, an unconscious invitation. His was usually closed, a sign of his need for solitude, for a space that was entirely his own. But in the weeks that followed the night I massaged his back, I noticed a subtle change. His door started to be left open, too. Just a crack at first, then a few inches, then wide open. It was a small thing, a detail most people wouldn't even register. But for me, the professional observer, the student of quiet moments, it was a seismic shift. It felt like a lowering of a drawbridge, a dismantling of a fortification. Our private spaces were bleeding into each other, the lines blurring. The apartment was ceasing to be two separate territories with a shared common area. It was becoming a single, unified home. The couch ritual continued, but it was now imbued with this new layer of physical touch. He no longer waited for sleep to claim him before accepting it. Sometimes, he would reach up and take my hand, pulling it to his shoulder or his back, a silent request. The physical boundary between us had been redrawn. The line moved so far from its original position that I could barely remember where it used to be. And yet, the silence remained. We never spoke of it. The morning after amnesia was still in full effect. It was a paradox that was slowly driving me mad. By night, we were intimate in a way that transcended friendship, our bodies speaking a language of comfort and care that was profound and deeply moving. By day, we were roommates, friends, our interactions marked by a careful, studied casualness that ignored the 8 hours of intimacy that had just passed. The breaking point, when it came, was not on the couch. It was in the hallway. It was a Sunday night. Alex was supposed to have been on a flight to San Francisco for a week-long conference. He had packed his bag that morning, the usual pre-trip ritual of him complaining about airline coffee and me reminding him to pack a decent sweater. But at 10 o'clock that night, Long after he should have been checked into his hotel, his key turned in the lock. He walked in, looking pale and exhausted, and dropped his travel bag by the door. "Flight was canceled," he said, his voice flat. "Mechanical issues. They rebooked me for tomorrow morning." "Oh," I said, surprised. I was in my doorway, on my way to bed. "Well, at least you get to sleep in your own bed tonight." He looked down the short hallway, first to his open bedroom door, then to mine. He looked hesitant, lost again. The confident consultant who navigated boardrooms and international airports seemed to have vanished, replaced by someone uncertain and vulnerable. "Yeah," he said, but he didn't move toward his room. He just stood there, caught in the liminal space of the hallway, the fluorescent overhead light casting long shadows. He looked at his room again, and a flicker of that same haunted expression I'd seen the night of his breakup crossed his face. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. I knew what he wanted, but the context was all wrong. There was no movie, no couch, no plausible deniability. There was just the quiet of our apartment and a choice. My heart was pounding. This was it, the moment of truth. The image in the darkroom was fully formed. It was time to turn on the lights, for better or for worse. I could say goodnight, retreat into my room, and close the door. I could reinforce the boundary, send the clear signal that our nighttime ritual was a product of circumstance, confined to the living room. It would be the safe thing to do. The self-preservationist in me, the one who had spent years building walls, screamed at me to do it. But the part of me that had spent the last few months holding him, learning the rhythm of his breathing, and memorizing the shape of his sleeping form couldn't do it. Losing him was my greatest fear, but I was beginning to realize that living in this silent, agonizing limbo was a special kind of torment in itself. I took a breath, and I stepped back into my room, leaving the door wide open. I didn't look at him. I just walked over to my bed, pulled back the covers on the side I didn't sleep on, and smoothed the duvet. It was an invitation. A clear, terrifying, unambiguous invitation. I was holding my breath, listening for the sound of his footsteps retreating to his own room. I braced myself for the quiet click of his door closing, the sound that would signal the end of this strange chapter, the sound that would shatter my heart into a million pieces. Instead, I heard his soft footsteps on the hardwood floor of the hallway. They didn't move toward his room. They moved toward mine. He appeared in the doorway, a silhouette against the brighter light of the hall. He stood there for a long moment, just watching me. I couldn't read his expression. Then he walked into my room. He didn't speak. He just moved to the side of the bed I had prepared, took off his shoes, and slid under the covers, his back to me. I was frozen, standing by the side of the bed. He was here, in my bed, by invitation. The implications of it were so enormous that my mind couldn't process them. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't falling asleep on the couch. This was a choice. We had both made a choice. I turned off the light and got into bed on my own side. The space between us felt like a mile-wide canyon. The silence was no longer comfortable or sleepy. It was electric, charged with 5 years of unspoken feelings and 3 months of ambiguous intimacy. We lay there, side by side in the dark, two rigid forms, our backs to each other, not touching. I had never been more aware of another person's presence in my entire life. I could feel the heat of his body across the small gap of mattress. I could hear the tiny, almost inaudible sound of him swallowing. Minutes stretched into an eternity. I lay there, my eyes wide open, staring at the faint shapes of my room in the darkness. I had made a catastrophic mistake. I had pushed too far, read too much into it. He was only here because his room felt lonely, and now I had made it weird, sexual, demanding. The shame was a physical weight on my chest. I had ruined everything. The friendship, the comfort, all of it. I had shattered the beautiful, fragile thing we had built in my desperate need for more. Just as I was sinking into a black hole of regret, his voice, small and rough in the darkness, cut through the silence. "Leo?" My heart stopped. "Yeah." I managed, my own voice a croak. There was a long pause. I could hear him take a breath. "Can I ask you something stupid?" "Okay." I whispered to the empty space in front of me. More silence. The anticipation was a physical pain. "Would it be okay?" He started, his voice cracking slightly. He stopped, cleared his throat, and tried again. "Would it be okay if I kissed you?" The world stopped turning on its axis. The bell, the one I had lived in fear of for so long, finally rang. But it wasn't a deafening, shattering clang. It was a clear, perfect, resonant note that vibrated through every cell in my body. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. I couldn't find my voice. My throat was closed tight with a knot of shock and relief and a terror that was so profound it was almost ecstatic. Instead of speaking, I turned over. He turned at the same moment, as if we were tethered by an invisible string. In the faint moonlight filtering through the window, I could just make out the shape of his face, his eyes wide and searching. He was so close. The air between us was thick with questions, with years of waiting. I gave a small, jerky nod. He moved slowly, tentatively, as if he were approaching a frightened animal. He raised a hand, his fingers trembling slightly, and cupped my cheek. His skin was warm. His thumb stroked gently along my jawline, a gesture of such exquisite tenderness that it almost broke me. He leaned in, and I closed my eyes. The kiss was not what I had imagined in my countless secret daydreams. It wasn't passionate or demanding or cinematic. It was quiet. It was hesitant. It was a question asked in a language that had no words. His lips were soft, uncertain, barely pressing against mine. It was a kiss that was asking for permission, a kiss that was braced for rejection. It was the most honest, vulnerable thing I had ever felt. I responded by leaning into him, a fraction of an inch, a silent yes. The tension in his body seemed to dissolve in an instant. The kiss deepened, but it remained gentle, a slow, unhurried exploration. It was a conversation we had been waiting years to have. It was relief. It was recognition. It was the feeling of coming home to a place you didn't even know you had been searching for. When we finally broke apart, we didn't move away. We stayed where we were, our foreheads resting against each other, our breath mingling in the small space between us. "Oh," he whispered, the word a soft puff of air against my lips. It was a sound of discovery, of dawning realization. "Oh." He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. He just wrapped his arms around me, pulling me against his chest, and held me. For the first time, I wasn't the one holding him. We were holding each other. I buried my face in the crook of his neck, breathing in his familiar scent, and felt the last of my carefully constructed walls crumble into dust. I fell asleep in his arms, feeling safer and more seen than I had in my entire life. The image was fixed. The light was on, and it was more beautiful than I could have ever imagined. I woke to the jarring emptiness of the other side of the bed. The morning light was pale and gray, filtering through the blinds, and the space beside me was cold. For a disoriented moment, I thought I had dreamt it all. The conversation in the dark, the question, the heart-stopping tenderness of his kiss. But the indent of his head was still on the pillow next to mine, a faint ghost of his presence, and the scent of him lingered in the sheets. It had been real. A cold dread, sharp and sudden, replaced the warm peace of the night before. I sat up, my heart starting to pound with a new kind of anxiety. I listened. The apartment was silent. Too silent. Usually, on a weekday morning, I could hear the shower running, the clatter of the coffee maker, the low hum of the news on his tablet. Today, there was nothing. I got out of bed and walked into the living room. His travel bag was gone from its spot by the door. A quick glance into his room confirmed it. Bed unmade, but otherwise empty. He was gone. He had left for his rebooked flight without a word, without a note, without waking me. He had slipped out of my bed, out of my room, out of the apartment, like a thief in the night. The beautiful, resonant note of the bell from the night before was replaced by a dull, sickening thud in my chest. The light that had illuminated the perfect image in my darkroom now seemed harsh and cruel, revealing every flaw, every speck of dust. I had been a fool. It had been a mistake. A moment of lonely, post-breakup confusion for him. A fleeting impulse he had regretted the moment the sun came up. He had used me for comfort, for warmth, and when he had crossed a line he couldn't uncross, he had fled. The pain was a physical thing, a hollow ache that spread from my chest through my entire body. It was so much worse than the years of quiet, secret yearning. That old ache had been a familiar companion, a manageable part of my internal landscape. This new pain was a raw, gaping wound. I had allowed myself to hope. I had dismantled my own defenses, brick by brick, and let him in. And he had walked out, leaving the door swinging open on a scene of devastation. The week he was gone was one of the longest of my life. The apartment felt vast and empty, the silence no longer a comfort but an accusation. Every object seemed to mock me. The couch where he had slept in my lap. The woolen blanket still draped over the armchair. The hallway where he had stood, looking lost. My own bed, which now felt like a crime scene. I moved through the rooms like a ghost, the ghost he had first called me. Only now I was haunting my own life. My phone remained silent. I texted him once, a casual, cowardly message. Hope the conference is going well. It was a test, a desperate plea for normalcy. He replied hours later. Yeah, it's fine. Busy. The words were clinical, detached. There was no warmth, no Alex in them. Just polite, distant code. I didn't text him again. The message was clear. He was rebuilding the walls, and he was building them higher than ever before. I tried to work. I went into my darkroom, the physical one this time, hoping the familiar process, the smell of the chemicals, the dim red light, would soothe me. But it was no use. I kept seeing his face, his hesitant smile in the moonlight. I kept feeling the ghost of his lips on mine. I ruined 3 prints in a row, my hands shaking too much to handle the tongs properly. The darkroom, once my sanctuary, felt like a tomb. By the time the day of his return arrived, I was a wreck. I had oscillated wildly between anger, hurt, and a pathetic, desperate hope that I had misunderstood his silence, that he would walk through the door with a perfectly reasonable explanation. I imagined the conversation 100 times. I would be cool and distant. I would be hurt and demanding. I would be understanding and patient. I had no idea who I would be, because I no longer knew what we were. He came back on a Friday evening. I heard his key in the lock, and my entire body tensed. I was sitting on the couch, pretending to read a book, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. He walked in, dropped his bag, and stood in the hallway, just as he had the night he'd left. The scene was a cruel echo of that pivotal moment, but the energy was all wrong. The air was thick with tension and unspoken words, but it wasn't the electricity of anticipation. It was the dead, heavy static of avoidance. Hey, he said, his voice quiet. He wouldn't meet my eyes. Hey, I replied, my voice miraculously steady. How was the trip? Fine. Long? He ran a hand through his hair, a nervous gesture I knew well. I'm just gonna go unpack. And with that, he retreated to his room and closed the door. The quiet click of the latch was the sound of a drawbridge being raised, a portcullis crashing down. It was a definitive statement. The intimacy was over. The bubble was burst. We were back to being roommates. Only now we were roommates who were pretending they hadn't shared the most intimate moment of their lives just a week ago. We spent the next 2 days in a state of excruciating, polite avoidance. We were 2 ghosts haunting the same apartment, moving through shared spaces with a careful choreography designed to minimize contact. We spoke in brief, functional sentences. Did you get milk? The mail is on the table. I'm heading out for a bit. The comfortable silence we had once shared, the silence that had been the bedrock of our friendship, was gone. It had been replaced by a tense, heavy quiet that was filled with everything we weren't saying. It was suffocating. I couldn't live like this. The not knowing, the pretending, it was eating me alive. The pain of rejection was one thing, but the slow torture of his polite withdrawal was another. I had to know. Even if the truth was the worst thing I could imagine, I had to hear it. I couldn't live in the ruins of what we'd had, pretending not to see the rubble all around me. Sunday night, I found him in the kitchen, staring into the open refrigerator as if the answers to the universe were hidden behind the mustard. His back was to me. I stood in the doorway, my heart in my throat. This was it. No more running. No more hiding. Alex, I said. My voice was quiet, but it cut through the hum of the fridge like a knife. He stiffened. He slowly closed the refrigerator door and turned to face me. He looked tired, his eyes shadowed. He leaned back against the counter, crossing his arms over his chest. A defensive posture. A wall. We need to talk, I said, keeping my voice level, betraying none of the turmoil inside me. He just nodded, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere over my shoulder. What was that? I asked, the question simple, direct. Last week. In my room. What was that? He swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. Leo, He trailed off, shaking his head. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have. It was a mistake. The words, even though I had expected them, hit me like a physical blow. A mistake. That's all it was. A footnote in his grief, a moment of weakness. A mistake, I repeated, my voice flat. So the past 3 months you, on my couch, every night, me, holding you while you slept, that was all just a mistake too. No, no, it wasn't like that, he said quickly, a flicker of something, panic? Guilt? In his eyes. You were being a good friend. The best friend. I was a mess. You know that. I was a mess, and you were there. And the kiss, Alex. I pushed, my voice starting to tremble despite my best efforts. Was that just being a good friend too? Because from where I was standing, it felt like something else. He finally looked at me then, his expression a mixture of desperation and utter confusion. I don't know, he said, his voice cracking. I don't know what that was. I was tired, and I don't know, Leo. I'm sorry if I gave you the wrong impression. I never meant to mess with your head or ruin our friendship. The anger, hot and sharp, finally broke through the hurt. Ruin our friendship? You think you're the only one who's been risking something? I have spent 5 years, Alex, loving you in silence. I buried it. I hid it. I did everything I could to protect what we had. I watched you fall in love with someone else, and I smiled, and I took your goddamn pictures because your happiness meant more to me than my own. And for 3 months, I have sat on that couch and let you use me as your personal teddy bear, your emotional security blanket, because I thought you needed me. And I was terrified every single second, but I did it. And that night, I finally thought. I thought maybe it wasn't just me. But it was, wasn't it? It was just me. The words hung in the air between us, raw and ugly and true. I was breathing heavily, the confession ripped out of me, leaving me exposed and bleeding on the kitchen floor. Alex looked stunned, as if I had physically struck him. He stared at me, his mouth slightly open. The silence stretched, and in it, I saw not anger or disgust, but a profound, dawning horror. The color drained from his face. 5 years, he whispered, the words barely audible. I just nodded, unable to speak, my throat tight with unshed tears. He pushed himself off the counter and took a step toward me, then stopped, as if there were an invisible wall between us. He looked utterly lost, his confident exterior completely stripped away, leaving only the confused, vulnerable man I had been holding for months. Leo, I'm so stupid, he stammered, his voice thick with emotion. I'm so stupid. I didn't see it. I never saw it. He looked around the apartment, at the couch, toward my bedroom, as if seeing it all for the first time. All this time, you were, and I was just... He couldn't finish the sentence. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. I don't have the words, he said, his voice muffled by his palms. I don't know the right words for any of this. Then stop talking, I said, my voice soft now, the anger draining away, replaced by a vast, aching tenderness. Just stop trying to find the words. He looked up, his eyes shining with tears. He took another hesitant step toward me. He didn't say anything. He didn't try to explain or apologize or define. He just closed the remaining distance between us, wrapped his arms around my waist, and buried his face in my shoulder. His body shuddered with a silent sob. And I held him. Again. But this time, it was different. All the walls were down. All the secrets were out. There was no ambiguity, no plausible deniability. There was only the raw, painful, beautiful truth. He didn't have the words. He had never had the words. His language wasn't verbal, it was physical. It was the exhausted lean on a car ride home. It was the seeking of a hand in the dark. It was the desperate need for closeness, a need he didn't understand but couldn't deny. It was the head in my lap. It was the hesitant, questioning kiss. His actions had been speaking a language his mind refused to translate. And I, the quiet observer, had been fluent in it all along. We stood there in the middle of the kitchen for a long time, holding each other. It wasn't a solution. It wasn't a neat and tidy ending. It was a beginning. It was the first honest moment we had shared since he had kissed me. When he finally pulled back, he kept his hands on my arms, as if afraid to let go completely. He looked at me, his eyes red-rimmed but clear. I'm sorry, he whispered. I'm so sorry I hurt you. I ran because I was scared. I looked at what I'd done, what I'd felt, and it didn't fit with any story I'd ever told myself about who I am. And I panicked. But being away from you, in that cold, empty silence, that was so much worse. I just looked at him, my heart feeling like a bruised, tender thing in my chest. So what now? I asked, the question hanging in the air, fragile and full of hope. He didn't answer with words. He leaned in and kissed me. It was different from the first time. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty. It was firm and sure, and full of a week's worth of regret and a night's worth of revelation. It was a promise. It was an answer. The days that followed were a process of careful, tender rebuilding. We didn't fall into an easy, immediate relationship. We had years of ingrained friendship and months of confusing, painful intimacy to navigate. But the silence was different now. The heavy, anxious static was gone, replaced by a quiet that was rich with potential. We started to talk, really talk. He spoke of his confusion, his fear of losing the one constant in his life. Our friendship, by admitting he had begun to feel something more. He admitted that his need for my touch, for my presence, had started long before he was consciously aware of it, a magnetic pull he couldn't explain or ignore. He still fumbled for the words, often trailing off with a frustrated sigh. "I'm not good at this, Leo," he'd say. "I don't know how to say what's in my head." "Then show me," I would reply, and he would. He would reach for my hand while we sat on the couch. He would wrap an arm around my waist while I was making coffee. He would fall asleep with his head on my shoulder, not in my lap, a subtle shift that made us equals in the exchange of comfort. These small actions were his vocabulary, the phrases in a language we were learning to speak together. They were his paragraphs, his sonnets. And I, in turn, learned to respond not with analysis, but with acceptance. I would lean into his touch. I would rest my head on his. I would take his hand and hold it, my fingers interlaced with his. Our apartment, once a map of boundaries and territories, became a truly shared space. The night after our confrontation, after we had talked for hours, we found ourselves standing in the hallway again, that liminal space between our two rooms. He looked at his closed door, then at my open one. He didn't say a word. He just took my hand, led me into my room, and closed the door behind us. That night, when we lay in bed, there was no canyon between us. He pulled me close, his body a warm, solid line against mine, and we slept, tangled together, in a silence that was finally, completely, peaceful. The door to his room remained closed after that, not as a barrier, but because he no longer needed it. His home was no longer a room. It was the space beside me. The rituals of our new life were quiet and domestic. Waking up together, the morning light soft on his face. The easy, unspoken dance in the kitchen as we made breakfast. The way he would find me in my studio, not to talk, but just to stand behind me while I worked, his chin resting on my shoulder, his arms wrapped around my chest, as we both stared at the image I was editing on the screen. He was no longer just the subject of my art. He was a part of its creation. One afternoon, a few weeks later, I was in my darkroom, developing the photos I had finally been able to take again. He came in, letting the door swing shut behind him, plunging us into the familiar, dim red light. He didn't speak, just came to stand beside me, watching as I gently rocked the tray of developer. An image was beginning to emerge on the paper. It was a photo I had taken of him a few days prior, asleep on the couch, the afternoon sun streaming through the window and illuminating the side of his face. He looked peaceful, safe. He was silent for a long time, watching his own image bloom out of the whiteness. "You see things," he said, his voice a low murmur in the quiet room. It was the same thing he had said to me the night we met, all those years ago. But this time, the words held a different weight, a new meaning. "I see you," I replied softly, my eyes on the photograph, on the man beside me, on the beautiful, undeniable truth that had finally been brought into the light. We never needed grand declarations or soaring romantic pronouncements. Our love story wasn't written in words. It was built, moment by quiet moment, in the spaces between them. It was found in the trusting weight of a head in a lap, in the shared warmth of a blanket, in the hesitant question whispered in the dark. He never did learn to find all the right words. He didn't have to. He had shown me, in 1,000 silent, tender ways, everything I had ever needed to know. And we began to heal, and to build, and to love, in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together.